Thank you. Well, what a subject. The challenge of religious freedom in areas of unrest. Meaning, war, popular uprisings, invasions, natural disasters, repression. All of these present special difficulties for the challenge of maintaining religious freedom. So I want to ask each panelist briefly to make some remarks about that. We obviously have a limited amount of time. How do we act in, how do we cope with these challenges? Maybe I can start with Governor Beasley from the World Food Program. I assume that unfortunately the World Food Program is active in lots of places that meet those criteria.
We're the world's largest humanitarian operation. We feed about 160 million people any given day, week, or month. So 80% of our operations are in areas of war and conflict. So we see firsthand what happens when there's not religious freedom. From conflict, it could be ISIS or Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab, or it could be Sunni versus Sunni or Shia versus Shia, and that could go on and on and on. And so one of the things you learn when you are in all the countries that we are around the world, you see what happens when people don't have religious freedom. Or religion is used to exploit, to conflict, destabilize, whatever the case may be. And it's only gotten worse in the last few years. When I took this role 6 years ago, there were 80 million people, as we would say, out of a population of 7.6 billion that were marching towards starvation. That number now of a world population of 8 billion people is now 350 million. And if we had time, which we don't, I would break it down into which countries where the numbers have skyrocketed because of conflict, most of which is religious-based. It's quite extraordinary how mankind will use religion for their own purposes and not for the purpose of the Almighty, who said to love your neighbor and to love your enemy. But anyway, we are where we are, and being the world's largest operator out there, Elliott, we see it. We see it firsthand, and everybody on the planet pays a price. You're talking about $18 trillion economic impact of the global economy because of these types of conflicts. Imagine what we could do with $18 trillion of the impact of conflict, war, most of which is religious-based extremism and conflict. So,
a sad story in many, many ways. Let's turn to another sad story for Dr. Jianli from the organization called Citizen Power Initiatives for China. Citizen Power Initiatives for China. What can you tell us about the religious freedom situation? I'm afraid to ask in China.
Thank you, Elliott. China's war on faith shows no sign of abating. And the religious freedom is dying, if you will, in China under Xi Jinping. Against the backdrop of pandemic restrictions along with cross-border persecution of religious groups, including Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, Falun Gong Protestants, Catholics, and etc. The year of 2022 saw the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, prepare the Chinese people for its 20th Congress, at which Xi Jinping rose from a ruler to a de facto emperor. So the CCP pressured all religious groups to evangelize about the glories of Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping thought. Churches, mosques, temples were ordered to display banners with CCP ideological slogans, to perform the national anthem before singing hymns, and to demonstrate loyalty to Xi Jinping and the CCP regime above all. Ultimately, the reason that China has no tolerance for faith is because the CCP wishes to replace human need to worship with a substitute religion centered around the party. Any faith or any individual believer that is not completely in line with the China-centered identity or the party-centered allegiance is considered a splitting or subverting element, and therefore ought to be eradicated. In a sense, Xi Jinping is a reincarnation of Mao Zedong in crackdown on freedom of religion. The only difference is that Xi Jinping is modernly armed with high tech. Now here comes to the policy suggestion. What should we do about it? In past years, we used the name the shame strategy and sanctions. These are all good. I think should continue. But we have to admit these strategies have not bring about much effect yet. So when I talk high tech, I really mean high tech. China is weaponized it. Cameras everywhere watch religious activities, online restriction for message for religious activities. I think many people in this room know that. So what we should do, I think, if we do one thing, that is to empower the people of China, those of faith in China, with technology, so that they can communicate, organize freely, without fear, so that they can gradually grow their civil society, if you will. So this needs a political will from the government. We need technology. We need civil society people. We also need many people's effort. So Dr. Katrina Sweat has been a leader on this issue. I would like more will join in this effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Bohdan Movchan is the head of humanitarian cooperation in the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. And we mentioned war and invasion as some of the challenges to religious freedom. You now have parts of the country that have been seized by Russia. What are the special problems that you face in protecting religious freedom then today in Ukraine?
Yeah, we got a peculiarity. But first, let me thank you for your kind invitation. And let me also express my profound gratitude for this chance to deliver the message about the situation within my country. Well, as all of you know, the freedom of religion and belief is guaranteed by a number of international legal documents, particularly by the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, is Article 18, and also OSCE Helsinki final document, which is Article 24. But I would like to speak not like a diplomat, just because these mechanisms are very hard to implement at the circumstances, very narrow circumstances, which are still persist in my state. Just like a human being, I would like to elaborate about that. What is actually core of this freedom of religion? This is a question how to refer to God and the right to refer to pray in your own language. This right is brutally imperiled, and it's under the threat of total elimination. So this right is under the imminent threat now. And it's not about unrest, actually. It's about a battlefield. Because my fatherland now is a battlefield. And what is happening on this battlefield is a battle for the democracy, for liberty, for tolerance, for the essence of this right to be better as a person, to be higher in a spiritual way. And then another question arose. Well, what is the essence of the crime? It's a criminal intent. It's a desire to be, or to prove that you or the person, he or she, is better than someone else. Is search or seek for proof that the one person or group of persons, community or nation is more strength, is more strong or developed than the other. And this kind of issue, this kind of problem, my nation, Ukrainians, have been facing for ages. And only 9 years ago, in 2014, just this problem revealed. So international community started to understand what is a threat and what is a ominous perspective if we would not protect this freedom of one nation. And only 11 months ago, the international community realized that this threat is real, imminent, and it concerns not only one nation. It relates to the safety and security of the whole European continent, and actually the whole world order is put on stake. So to be brief, I would like to use this opportunity to call on our international partners. Don't stop supporting Ukraine in this very unpredictable, uncertain time. We are appreciating your every effort, and we will do our best to engage as many international partners as we only can to implement the 10-point peace formula introduced by our President, Volodymyr Zelensky. We hope that our common, joint, concerted efforts will put the end to this war of absolutely unjustified and unprovoked aggression, and there's going to be peace and tolerance in my state as it was before. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Rose Richter, impact Iran. We've seen the people of Iran in the streets significantly in the last year, though not for the first time. What is the situation of religious freedom now in the midst of this citizen action in Iran?
Well, the situation of freedom of religion or belief in Iran has always been quite dire. And the last few months, we've seen social unrest, and the government's response to it has been brutal. 19,000 arrests, 2/3 of those individuals have been sentenced to prison, 16 to death, and 4 have already been executed. And I think, what we're seeing in Iran just in terms of social unrest, is indicative of a range of human rights concerns that have taken place and have been, occupying the minds of Iranians and international community for the last 40 years. Now, freedom of religion or belief, we've heard, I'm sure, as earlier today, is an indicator that a range of other human rights are also being respected: freedom of expression, freedom of association and assembly, the right to privacy, the right against discrimination, and so on. And these are fundamental rights, cornerstones of democracy that are infringed upon on a daily basis for all in Iran. And so it's not surprising that what we see in terms of freedom of religion or belief in Iran is quite one of a situation of severe restriction and one where any influencer that emerges from these communities is reacted to by the government with extreme violence. And I think that remains the future responses that I think we'll be able to expect from the government.
I'm tempted to ask if this is all very grim. If there's a more positive story that, I'll ask you, Governor Beasley, have you seen interfaith relationships help solve problems of civil strife or intergroup strife, maybe religious leaders or religious groups coming together?
Yeah, we've had, we deal with it every day, and so we've seen a lot of positives as well as the negatives. I could get into, like Sudan, for example, which was part of the reason we won the Nobel Peace Prize for what we did in Sudan, working with Muslims and Christians coming together in Sudan to resolve some of the differences that we had there. That was about 2 years ago. We had that big breakthrough with different elements inside Sudan. And I could go on places where we've actually used food and caused different religious elements to lay down their weapons, and we would provide food if they'll do that and come to the table and talk. And that reaps a lot of positive things. So there are a lot of good things out there, but at the same time, a lot of bad things. As Doc was saying during COVID, which it caught me, it reminded me, for example, when COVID hit so rampantly around the world, but particularly in Northern Africa, where you had ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram, for example, and how COVID opened up an incredible window of opportunity for ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram to exploit the supply chain disruption when food wasn't moving, and so they used food as a weapon of recruitment. And it was just amazing how COVID created really a magnificent recruiting time for some of these extremist groups. And so it's extremely important, like we did in Afghanistan, for example, when the Taliban took over. And of course, we have to deal with the good, the bad, the ugly. Whoever controls an area, we have to negotiate with them to have access to reach the people we need to reach. And so in Afghanistan, we actually sat down, talked with the Taliban leaders on day one, and began negotiating with them from women's rights to all these different issues, which is a lot longer discussion. But one of the things that we also did with religious leaders, for example, some of the clerics in Saudi Arabia had such great respect to sit down with Taliban leaders, explain why this is right to respect others, religious freedom, women's rights, and things like this, showing that from their ancient scriptures, like in the Quran or the Hadith or whatever the case may be. But there's a lot of opportunity out there, and you can't let it sit and simmer, because it will, as you well know, you and I've worked on some pretty tough situations in the past, but right now, the whole world's so fragile, and we can't afford to sit back anymore. We've got to have religious leaders stepping up, protecting the rights and freedoms of others, because where that doesn't happen, you end up with war, conflict, and you end up with mass migration, not to mention starvation, mass migration, destabilization of nations. And the next 12 to 18 months, planet Earth is really in a very vulnerable stage with all these factors combined, from conflict to COVID to climate shocks to Ukraine crisis, inflation costs, as well as fertilizer issues and food costs and shipping costs. So this is a very, very trying time when you start talking about 350 million people starving to death out there. it's a very vulnerable time. Of course, we're all over Ukraine, as you well know, because we negotiated the Black Sea Grain Initiative with Zelensky and Putin's people, and we're in the middle of all that, and that's a whole nother discussion. But it all plays together, every bit of it, what you're talking about. So thank you, Elliott.
Yeah, let me go back to Dr. Yang and ask one of the facets of the religious freedom question in China, not the largest, but one of the interesting ones is the Catholic Church, which has been suffering a great deal since 1949. Yet there are relationships between the Vatican and the PRC, and the Communist Party. And I wondered if you'd just give us a comment about that, about those negotiations, those relationships.
Yeah, in recent years, China has increased its so-called religious diplomacy, if you will, and openly claim that religion is very important for its Belt and Road initiative. I'll just give you an example. So they give a great emphasis on that. And when it comes to Vatican, China-Vatican signed provisional agreement secretly. The real content has not been disclosed to the world, but we all know, it's concerning China's role in appointment of bishop. And it comes to us as a disappointment because why atheist regime has a role in appointment of Catholic bishops to begin with. And we know there's a very difficult relations between Vatican and Beijing simply because, the Vatican recognized church, Catholic Church, is not recognized by Beijing. It's outlawed, has been persecuted for many decades. We call it underground church. And Vatican's intention is to bring government-sanctioned church and underground church together, but doing so only to give Beijing authority over the entire church in China. And any church, Catholic church, who decide not to work with Beijing out of their conscience would be more easily outlawed by Beijing because they have such authority. And according to last 4 years, because the agreement was signed in 2018, according to reality, the experience in China in the past 4 years, the Catholic situation has not changed. If anything, worse. So I think we have to really alert to this issue when we come to dealing with Beijing. We know their real intention. We just cannot buy into what they say when they, engage in active diplomacy with us. Yeah.
We have 1 minute left, so I wanted to ask you, it could be an hour, but what has been the reaction of clerics in Iran to these crackdowns recently? All pro-government, or is it a mix?
Yes, it's a mix. And we've seen the narratives of clerics who tended to speak from a more conservative place shift in how they're reacting to the government's crackdown, especially as it pertains to those who represent ethnic and religious minority communities.
Okay, thank you. That was a nice brief answer. So we're gonna stay on time. Thank you all for being here, and please join me in thanking the panelists.